I think it's natural in regards to books to look at this whole thing as pages and words. I mean, it means so many things. When you're a reader, it's the time commitment that you can expect from a book that you're interested in, but it's also the potential for how lost you can get into that world. It's a symbol of pride to some that you read that 1,300-page book. To some, it's even how you justify your budget. When I was in college, I would seek out books that were the highest cost to length ratio that I could find. And to writers, word count is both a method of progress and success, but it's also maybe doing more harm than good. Welcome to the Writing Theory Podcast, a podcast for every level of writer. Everything that we discuss here on this podcast is about pushing you to the next level of storytelling. From prose to structure to the business of writing, you can join me every Monday for a new episode, a new topic, and a new takeaway that you can apply to your writing right away. I'm Carson Long. Let's get started. All right, look, I get it. Word counts and page numbers are almost a necessity. Like, we need some way to discuss things like progress and length and expectations and time requirements. I get all of that. But I think it's also evolved to be something that kind of colors outside of its own necessary lines. So let's talk about word count, specifically from the perspective of the writer. Right? So why do we use word count so much in writing? Right? For a lot of us, word count might be a daily goal. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write and I'm going to make sure that I'm getting 1,000 words a day. And if I do that every single day, I'll have a book ready in, I guess, 80 days. Speaking of, that word count is also sort of a metric of success in terms of I'm going to write a book, so it has to be this amount of words. And if I don't hit this amount of words, did I just write a novella? Is this just a long, short story? So word count comes up in all these different ways. It's a measure of progress. It's an expectation. It even defines the contracts that you might sign when you go maybe towards traditional publishing. And the industry standards around word count influence everything that we want to accomplish. When you plan your story, there are plot frameworks like Save the Cat, where you use sort of your target word count to then define what the pacing of your story might be. Your, first act of your story is 25% of your whole story. Your inciting incident should happen 10% into your story. That final word count dictates so much about your story. And even when it comes to trying to communicate with the right readers, readers have a set of expectations for what they want to read. And this sort of publishing mindset of how word count plays into your story and the reader expectation have kind of been developed together. There are people who won't pick up a book because it's too long, or a different set of readers won't pick up a book unless it's long enough. Like I said, back in college, I was really struggling for money. And so I still wanted to read. I didn't have a Kindle or anything. This was kind of, ebooks were around, but they weren't as prevalent as they are right now. And so I would go to bookstores and I'd be like, I have $8. What is the longest book I can get for $8? And that's how I chose what books to read. So it kind of begs the question, if word count is so important, both to the publishing side and to the reading side, what has the evolution of word count been, and how does that affect us today? So let's take a little detour here, and let's talk about sort of the extremes, right? What books have come out into the world that have really short word counts, and what are these sort of other best-selling books that may have really long word counts, and what does that tell us about what we need to write? In the early 20th century, right, the mid-1900s, the early 1900s, there were a lot of books coming out. And back then, these books were probably going to be comparatively short. I mean, you can think of some, and of course, these are kind of cherry-picked numbers, but, in these mid-1900s, these early 1900s, printing costs were much higher. right? The publishers were seeking out stories that were going to earn them more money. So they needed stories that they thought were going to sell well, but that also weren't going to incur crazy printing costs. So books like The Great Gatsby comes in at roughly 47,000 words, and that was published in 1925. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley is 64,000 words. Both of these, by today's categories, would be novellas. And we'll talk about this sort of categorization of stories by word count because it's all BS, but there is a reason that it's there. But both of these books nowadays might be seen as too short to even want to publish. A lot of people will tell you that the novella as sort of a classification of book is not really a popular thing anymore. And purposefully writing a novella in efforts to get it traditionally published is maybe a lot harder to do. Even though now it sort of begs the question, if you could still charge $12 for that book and spend less on printing costs, why aren't publishers more interested in that? Maybe the market's not there. That's probably what it is. All right, let's go back to the mid-20th century again. Let's say 1950s, roughly, 1970s. We got a couple books that come out that definitely sort of break the mold. And these weren't the only long books. But we have Dune comes out in 1965 at 185,000 words. And The Fellowship of the Ring in 1954 at 187, roughly, thousand words. Both of these pretty long books, even by today's standards. And you can go to the bookstore now and you can even see, I'm scanning the bookshelves. Oh, here's a real chonker of a book. It's one of the Dune books. But something that you may notice here is both of these are kind of genre fiction books. Science fiction and fantasy are a little bit more niche. And what's going to happen over the next 50 years is that both science fiction and fantasy are going to continue to develop into longer stories. The reader expectation is I'm picking up this book to get lost in the world. Now, in the late 90s, we see, again, more long best-selling novels, but they're still the outliers. But The Stand by Stephen King, which releases an uncut, unabridged version, comes out at 400 to 500,000 words. Even Harry Potter, Order of the Phoenix, a book meant for YA audiences, is now a chonker of a book at 250-something thousand words. The bestseller list is starting to get more filled up with longer books. And we're kind of breaking out of the genre fiction. Now, this is kind of a tough one because, right, Stephen King is, primarily a horror novelist, but The Stand is, while it is still his same unique flavor of horror and he's so popular, so he's got a big name behind it, it is more of just like a weird fiction than it is like a horror novel. And Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix coming in at 200-something thousand words. I mean, can you think of a book that's selling more copies than Harry Potter at its prime? Now, this new generation of readers is seeking out those kind of big books that they can get fully lost in. And Harry Potter is one of the reasons why that is. I think from this point on, things start to get a little bit more mixed. YA, especially, has a very wide range of what word counts might be. And I don't know if this stems from reader expectations or what the market was like, or if publishers realize that they can sell and or charge more for a longer book. But Hunger Games comes out at 9,900 something thousand words. A Game of Thrones hits the bestseller lists at 290, 300,000 words. And so now it's becoming really common that longer stories get attention. Instead of being an outlier that happened earlier, in the 1900s, I say earlier in the 1900s, like I'm not talking about 1960. That's how these two things sound very different. It seems like publishers are realizing there is a pretty big market for pretty big books. And so they're more willing to take on potentially higher printing costs, even though I would also hazard a guess that lower printing costs have also led to this sort of being a more acceptable word count for a book. They're willing to take risks on longer books. Now, the bestseller kind of formula that's been in place for so long is always kind of trying to emphasize that 80,000 to 100,000 word book. And we see that with so many books that are specifically written for like that general audience, the James Patterson kind of books, the John Grisham kind of books, right? They have it so much like into a standardized formula. You know that these books, and I would even suggest that maybe they're trending a little bit beyond that. But when you pick up one of those books, you're getting about a 300-page book. That's kind of the publisher best-selling formula answer to word count. But today, we do see a very wide variety of word counts. And more than ever, it is just genre dependent. A romance book is likely to be shorter and snappier than a science fiction or a fantasy book. YA allows there to be all kinds of different word counts, ranging from books that are 600 to 800 pages, and then little shorter standalone books that may only come in at 200 something pages. YA is kind of just like a free-for-all, it feels like. And then when you look at self-publishing just honestly, word count is really not even considered in a lot of self-publishing, especially when you're looking at these same sort of genre fiction books. So if you go into the self-publishing space and you look at fantasy, who knows what you're going to find? If you look at science fiction, who knows? You might get a book like The Murderbot Diaries, I think is what it's called, which are all really short, snappy books that are super highly praised. Or you might look at it and get something like The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wong, I believe is how you say it, which is a pretty big book. It can kind of go any way. And we see that also reflected in audiobooks, which I think is kind of crazy. I mean, like the #1 best-selling audiobook of all time on Audible, I think is Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings, because that one credit that Audible gives you will either let you redeem it for a story that's 18 hours or a Sanderson book that's like 64 hours or something crazy like that. And so it comes back again to that idea of budget, right? How I was in college. Yeah, I mean, if you only get X amount of Audible credits and you want the most bang for your buck, Sanderson is on the front pages and has a lot of words. So I guess what it comes down to is like, you know, there are some short books that have made that bestsellers list over the years. The Alchemist is a book that's super popular. It's one of the most, printed books in the world. It's 40,000 words. Fight Club, iconic, roughly 49,000 words. And I'm totally ignoring books like Animal Farm, Of Mice and Men, The Old Man and the Sea, that might have come out in those mid-1900s. But on those bestseller lists, we also had George R.R. Martin. Nearly 10 times the length of books like The Alchemist or Fight Club. A Storm of Swords is 414,000 words. There's even a book that came out called A Suitable Boy by Vikram Seth at 591,000 words. Bestseller, highly praised. How does this reflect back on things like classic literature? Because I think my initial understanding of classical literature was that old books were all pretty long, right? Don Quixote, long book. The Count of Monte Cristo. Oh no. The Count of Monte Cristo, not Crisco. This is not a branded segment. But I think a lot of those classical literature books you forget were written over a longer period of time. And especially with authors like Charles Dickens, were serialized. So they were putting out a chapter at a time for months and months and months. And there's always the thought that I believe I read somewhere that those authors who were getting published in that way were getting paid by like the word. So then that begs the question. I mean, were you being a little superfluous with your words just to earn that extra buck? And you know what? I don't blame them. And even Don Quixote, I love this fact. I don't know if everyone knows about this. Don Quixote was written so long ago. It was in these days where like there was no way, if you got your hands on that first printing of Don Quixote, there was no way for you to know if this book was ever going to get a sequel, if another book was going to come out by this author. For all you know, that author could have passed away, 4 years ago. And so with Don Quixote, that first book was printed and put out in the world and got so popular. This was like the late 1400s, I think. Someone else wrote the second book to Don Quixote. and put it out. And the original author was like, what the hell? Someone wrote part 2 to my best-selling book? And so the original author wrote part 3 that basically had Don Quixote waking up from a dream and being like, none of that other stuff ever happened. Here is the continuation of the story. So you never know what's happening with classical literature. Don't get fooled. They were not all big behemoths like I kind of, for some reason, thought. So in the modern day, for us writers, what do we do with word count? Does word count become a limitation, right? Do you chase a word count number as part of the selling process of your story? Does that take more precedent than the actual wanting to tell a great story? Is there an acceptable word count that you're trying to hit because that's what other people tell you to? And is there a misconception that more words equals better writing? Let's look at the psychology of word count. I kind of think we're obsessed with word counts in a way, as writers. And like we just talked about, a lot of it has sort of been done to us by publishing. Publishing said 80,000 words is a novel. If you want to write a story, it's got to be 80,000 words. But then we also get other things that we've kind of done to ourselves. You know, National Novel Writing Month is a huge sort of event in our space in November. And whether you're doing a NaNoWriMo, I always am bad at saying that. Easy to write, harder to say. Or you're doing some sort of writing sprint. We did Novella November last year. The goal of that is more to write a certain amount of words than it is to say I'm going to finish a story or I'm going to finish X% of my story. And of course, the discussion that happens around that sort of time period is, does the focus on trying to hit that word count impact the quality of what you write? I would love to hear what you think about that. Do you think people sacrifice quality for a certain word count, especially if you are trying to hit a daily word count or a monthly word count in a National Novel Writing Month kind of sprint? Or do you think that speed in your first draft has very little effect on the final quality of the edited work? I would love to hear your thoughts if you're not already part of our Discord. That's where we have sort of continued discussion after the episode's released. You can hop over into the Discord. There's a link in every single one of my YouTube videos. You can join us over there, and you can join the podcast discussions or even leave a comment right on this and whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on. But if you want to do some back and forth, the Discord's the place to be. I want to hear your thoughts. So go ahead, let me know. Go ahead. Go ahead. You got 10 seconds to make your point, and I'll just listen. So 3, 2, 1, go. Uh-huh. Yeah. You know what? That's a really good point. 10 seconds is up. I like your viewpoint. That's a really good, I never thought of it that way. Speaking of daily writing word counts, I think personally I'm moving away from that. I don't think I no longer consider I'm going to write 1,500 words a day. I don't think that is quite the way to do it. In my next draft, what I'm really going to try to do is either write 1 chapter a day, whatever that word count is, or write until I'm just satisfied, till I feel like I've done a good amount of work, and then leave it and be done with it. That second one is sort of a cheat code for like some smoother mental health sailing while writing a book. Do you think daily word counts are a helpful motivation or something that's more stress-inducing? My big issue is if I sit down, let's say my word count goal for the day is to write 1,500 words. And if I write 1,200 words, at the end of the day, I still kind of feel like I failed. I've seen other authors say in writing books to set your target word count pretty low. Try to write 500 words a day. And every time you overshoot it, that's a good day. But to be honest, sitting down and being like, I need to write more than 500 words a day doesn't really feel challenging or satisfying enough to me to really feel rewarded at the end of it. So I have never really latched onto that idea. But the idea that you would feel guilty for only writing 1,200 words a day instead of your 1,500 word goal does leave me with a bad taste in my mouth, because that's still great progress, which is, I think, the biggest folly of word counts. How do you think word count affects the final result of the story? If you're trying to get traditionally published, then you do have to sort of resort to this classification of stories. To make sure I get my numbers right, I pulled up a quick chart here by The Right Life, WRITE. And the way that they advertise sort of the word counts for the different classifications of novels is an adult novel is between 50 and 100,000 words. The novella is between 14 and 40,000 words. The young adult novel is between 50 and 80,000 words. A middle grade book is between 25 and 40,000 words. And then everything else is nonfiction, and they can range so wildly. So what's the point of this sort of classification? I think the biggest thing is simply just communicating what you're writing and kind of what your market is for the story that you're writing. Because there is a different market between a novel and a novella. But beyond that, word count is total BS in regards. These are made up. I need you to realize these are made up numbers. These are just pulled out of thin air. These are made up numbers. You can do whatever you want, especially if you're self-publishing. But if you're traditionally publishing, understanding those classifications might help you communicate what your story is to another person in a better way. So if you're attempting to write a novel, does that mean you might pad your story a little bit in order to get that more prestigious 80,000 word novel, best-selling formula kind of word count? Or if you're an overwriter, are you cutting more, not because you're trying to make a better story, but because the 80,000 word novel is more ideal or sellable? I'm doing air quotes, by the way. And we always say the best stories are like quick paced, lean, efficient, kill your darlings. We all say that. But is that necessarily true? I think we've seen, especially within genres, the idea that, of course, different genres have different goals. A romance book, quick and snappy, get us to the good stuff, while a fantasy book might be more of a slow burn, like Tad Williams' The Dragonbone Chair, which feels like the first 300 words are all just slow burn world building and backstory. It's like the first half of The Sword and the Stone, if you ever remember watching that movie. Just a goofy kid running around a castle. But you fall in love with the characters. You start understanding the political threads that are happening behind the scenes that you're not even exposed to. And then everything comes crashing down and you're excited. You wouldn't see something like that in like a thriller novel. A thriller novel is like, let's get to the inciting incident as quickly as we can and then start the story. You know what I mean? So how can we rethink word count as writers? I think the easiest thing to say is, first off, the daily word count sort of goal is a metric worth considering, but you should not determine your worth around the word count. If you write a beautiful chapter that's 1,000 words and your daily word count's 1,500, you should feel satisfied and proud of what you wrote that day, instead of being like, all right, I need to get at least 500 more words down in order to feel like I did what I needed to do. That doesn't mean that we're trying to write fewer, better words. Again, I don't think speed and quality are things that you have to choose between, especially because we edit our story so much. I'm shifting my mindset away from word count daily goals and more towards feeling satisfied, impacting my story enough to feel like I did something worth being proud of. Whether that's a chapter, whether that's less, whether it's a sprint and I get through 3 or 4 chapters ravenously. And I think shifting the mindset away from word count kind of just empowers your revision process. Drafting your story is just step 1 in like a 10-step process of writing an entire story that you're going to share with the world. The thing about drafting is that we're all easily at that stage. We have a lot less conversation around editing and revision because it's a lot harder to get to that stage. So if 1,000 people start their first draft, how many people actually make it to the editing and revision stage after they have a fully completed proto draft? The metric you might see online, which is completely unfounded and has no original source as far as I can tell, and I've tried to hunt it down, is like 3% of people that begin a first draft actually finish it. So if 1,000 people are starting their first draft, only 30 are going to walk away with a finished one. Again, I have not found any sort of credibility to that statement, but it's repeated time and time and time and time and time again. And that's why we don't focus nearly as much in discussing editing and revision unless you purposely seek that out. We talk so much about the draft process because so many more people are stuck there. How do you want to shift your mindset away from word count? Do you think it would be more satisfying to consider the amount of scenes or chapters that you've completed in sitting down to write instead of words written? Or do you think it should be time-based? I'm going to sit down for 45 minutes. I'm going to put my phone on the other side of the room, and I'm going to write until that alarm goes off, and then I'm done for the day. Or do you think it should be something more focused on the quality of words? I don't care how many words that I write, but I'm really going to sit down and try to make this first draft as high quality as I can. I personally am not of that last mindset. Maybe it's something I'll try out in the future. When I see other writing YouTubers do like a live stream where they're writing, I feel like I see them look at their story, ponder, take a deep breath, take a sip of tea, write a sentence, pick up their cup, ponder, take a sip, put down their tea, write a sentence. And I'm over here like that gif of Jim Carrey from Bruce Almighty with my fingers blurring over the keyboard. I'm typing so fast. So I don't know. I'm built different, I think is what I'm supposed to say. What do you think? What is the approach that you think would lead to you feeling the most satisfaction in how you write, but also still being able to make the progress where you're going to get to the end of that story in 3 months? By the way, that's what Stephen King says. You should only ever take 3 months to write and finish a draft. That's what the King says. I think combining this new mindset away from word count with something like a habit tracker and just further encouraging you to at least touch your story once a day is maybe the most powerful combination known to man. And I think that's what I'm going to be trying next. There's some power to the habit tracker, I'm telling you. If you don't know what a habit tracker is, that's just like something that you use where you can kind of keep track every time that you've done this thing that you want to make into a habit, whether it's exercising, whether it's reading, whether it's writing. My favorite ones are ones where you have a big grid and you just fill in the next square on the grid every single time that you do that habit thing. Each square is a day. And then a couple weeks later, you're looking at that grid and it's all filled up and there's like a feeling of pride. And of course, writing is more about, the number of words that you put down. It's also about what's the point of them? What's the point of your story? And it's totally okay if the point of your story is to just tell a good story, is to just have something that's entertaining and exciting. Not everything that we write needs to be a thought-provoking reflection of the real world. You know what I mean? But if that's a story you do want to write, then best of luck. I think no matter what you're writing, it's of course something you have to be passionate about. And it can be that you are passionate about the characters and the setting and the world and the plot and the way that the reader feels when they read it. You can be passionate about the impact that you have on the reader simply in regards to entertainment. But if you do want to tell the story that's more poignant, then of course you have to be passionate about the message that you're sending. I encourage you to rethink how you track your progress for your story with any of the methods that we've talked about today. And I would love to hear your thoughts on word counts and the obsession around word count in our writing processes and writing routines. Again, you can head to the Discord if you want to partake in some of the conversation about these episodes, or you can leave a comment on this podcast. I do see them all, I promise. The best thing that you can do to support this podcast and to get more writing content is to simply rate the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to. And if you want more writing content, there is an astounding amount of writing content over on my YouTube channel, Writing Theory. If you haven't checked it out already, I would love to see you over there. Let me know in the comments that you got here through the podcast, because I see all of those comments too. And I end every video with, as always, thanks for watching. I really got to nail down what my outro is for the podcast, because as always, thanks for listening doesn't quite carry the same weight. To be continued, does that carry some weight? All right, whatever. I hope you like this podcast. I'll see you next Monday.